committee to order. I guess it is working. Quorum is present. Members, we've got two bills and an overview from the Department of Broadband today. I'm going to turn the gavel over to our very qualified vice chair here and present the first bill on RFA. Members, we had a printing glitch and it's getting printed. If you don't have it, certainly the bill, but we can get started on the RFA testimony and pull it up online if you want until you get the printed copy. We won't move on it until we have a printed copy. Remember, but let me get mark this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the kind words. Being eminently qualified for this position, I don't know what that qualification is, but I do have a nice Northland Technical College pin today, so I take that's probably it.
We have a course thing.
Well, then I am qualified. Well, Senator Western moves Senate File 3408. This will be going to the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Western, are you aware of any amendments to this bill?
Can offer you aware? I'm not aware of any, but
nothing. Mr. Chair, Senator Western, I'm not aware of it. This is boilerplate. This is basically the same language that
we've done for 20 years. No, I'm not, Mr. Chair.
With that, then to the bill.
Mr. Chair, members, I would move Senate File 3408 for be recommended to pass and re-referred to the Finance Committee. This bill is straightforward. It would authorize an additional $50 million for the RFA, Rural Finance Authority, something we've done every year or two in the past. So the last one, as I recall, was $35 million. We are running out of those funds, as we'll have someone from the RFA testify shortly. And this program is very helpful for beginning farmers, but also farmers maybe in the financial distress or a situation where they don't have the equity or the balance sheet or the cash flow that is needed to get a traditional, conventional farm loan. And that's the purpose of the RFA, is to step in as a partner of 45% of the guarantee, and the local lenders still taking 55% of the guarantee. But in many cases, and I think some of the testimony you'll hear briefly is just the help that this can be for a farmer to stay farming and work through some of those struggling economic times. And that's why we're here to help those farmers that are needing this, and the banks are certainly in the peak of writing new operating agriculture loans right now, and so we want to try to be responsive to this and address this before the RFA would run out. And my understanding is they're very close to running out in the next week or 2 weeks. So with that, Mr. Chair, I just open it up to the testifiers to add some background and a little more context to this, and open it up for any questions that members have.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Westrom. Mr. Lawyer, on the table.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Were we going to hear from the RFA first, or?
No, I don't have them down on the list. If there is anybody here. Yeah, so
okay.
Mr. Senator Westrom, I think we'll just have.
Perfect. I thought RFA was going to be.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Stu Laurie. I'm the Government Relations Director for Minnesota Farmers Union. And I've been on the record before, and we submitted a letter last week, but just wanted to express our strong support for funding this at $50 million and funding RFA early. As we've been putting out the word about this program, I've been hearing from members. Got a call from one. They farm in Blue Earth County as part of their transition plan to their daughter. she rents some land from a neighbor and grazes cattle in addition to working off farm. That landowner has told them that this coming season he hopes to sell that piece of property, and they're trying to cobble together financing like right at this moment, and RFA could be that kind of critical piece for that family and be the difference between whether she's able to continue farming and building equity and someday taking over her family's operation. And I think that story's not unique. And would also just like to highlight that there is precedent for passing RFA early and outside of a full bonding package. Of course, it doesn't require that supermajority because it is user financed, but there's precedent for breaking it out apart. We did that in 2017, and our ask as Minnesota Farmers Union would be that you do that again and provide certainty to farmers ahead of this coming growing season. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Josie Linetti with the Minnesota Farm Bureau. I want to echo Mr. Lurie's comments as well for the need to pass this quickly. As agriculture continues to experience serious financial and emotional challenges, the loan programs provided through RFA can mean keeping that farmer continuing on the land or being able to pass that to the next generation. We appreciate Chair Westrom for bringing this bill forward and understanding that with the record levels of participation for RFA, bonding dollars are needed to meet those funds. So thank you very much, and we certainly support this bill moving forward.
Well, thank you. Senator Westrom, any final comments?
Mr. Chair, I forget the specific statistic, but it's very low. I've always been impressed with the payback and the low number of losses in this program, because it is stepping in a more challenged situation. It is lower interest rate. That's one of the benefits that gets blended into the farmer's operating loan or construction loan or whatever the purpose of the loan is for that agriculture entity. But the last I recall, the loss ratio is less than 1/2 of 1%. My recollection is saying like 0.2% of loss ratio in this program. And so very, very impressive when you start thinking of the millions of dollars that go out in guarantees and loans. The banks are still scrutinizing and working up the programs with the farmers. And many times this is the difference of that new beginning farmer being able to get started, or the farm transitioning, or the farm into financial distress, needing a little bit of help to make that loan, to revise their operation, to get back in the positive cash flow again, and where this can be that egg or cog that makes that work. That's the purpose of this. But I've always been impressed with how low of default rate there is in this program, and from my conversations with the RFA and Department of Ag, any default is covered in basically the spread of the interest between the bonds and the amount covered or charged by the program, and the low default rate makes that possible, but indicates how well run the organization, the loans and the program has been run. And so I just bring that to people's attention. This is not a cost to the taxpayers or anyone else. It's just facilitating loans and operating capital in those areas of need.
Well, thank you, Senator Westrom. Committee members have anything to say? Thank you, Senator. Senator Westrom renews his motion and is recommended to pass. It's being re-referred to the Senate Finance Committee. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion passes. Moving on to finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members.
still on deck here. So next we'll move to agenda item number 3, the broadband overview from the Minnesota Office of Broadband. I'd like to have Angie Dickinson come up. Oh, welcome to the committee. State your name for the record.
Hello, my name is Angie Dickinson. I'm with the Office of Broadband Development. Diane Wells is also with the Office of Broadband Development. I'm actually a Department of Commerce employee working over there under your agency.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Good afternoon. My name, as I said, is Angie Dickinson, and I'm with Diane Wells. We are here representing the Office of Broadband Development that is located within D. Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members, thank you for dedicating this time to a deeper dive on broadband policy, programs, and issues. Our office hears about the importance of this issue daily as we receive calls from communities and the public seeking answers and help finding better broadband options in their areas. We were asked to give you a general overview of the state's broadband policy and programs, along with a snapshot of where we are today. We are also happy to answer more detailed questions during Q&A. This timeline slide is included so that you have some of the historical context of broadband policy development in Minnesota. I would note 2 things about this slide. The first is that the work has been going on for some time, starting back in 2008 and even earlier. The second important point about this slide is that Minnesota's policy and programs have been adopted incrementally and iteratively. Each step has been taken after careful consideration of the new information gathered during the previous step. This has led us to the 4 elements of an approach that we now have in place today, and that folks around the country are referring to as the Minnesota broadband model. This slide shows the 4 tiles that make up Minnesota's broadband policy and program work. When we are asked about the state's broadband plan, we talk about how it is deliberately high level and dynamic in order to respond to changing conditions and the unique combination of variables that exist within each region of our state. The first element to consider are the state broadband goals. These goals set a compass point for all of our work. There are 2 speed goals in state statute for the years 2022 and 2026, along with goals to be national leaders in both the access and use of robust broadband. The second component is the data and mapping program. This work allows our office and others to measure progress toward goals, identify gaps, and check the need for program realignment to address evolving needs and conditions across the state. The third piece provides a focal point and guidance. The broadband office within DEED gives us a place from which to support communities and the providers doing the work to deploy broadband and make sure we are leveraging those investments to the fullest extent possible. The other work of the office will be covered in the next slide. The other entity on this tile is the Governor's Task Force on Broadband, which brings together a diverse group of broadband stakeholders to provide guidance on broadband policy going forward. Finally, the grant program was created in 2014 and gives us a tool to materially participate in and collaborate on solutions to close and deploy broadband to these high-cost areas. This next slide is meant to be a reminder that the Office of Broadband does many things outside of the grant program. I'm not going to read this entire slide to you, as you may have already heard about many of these items. I would just note some items that haven't already been mentioned, but are very important. Many of these take the form of cross-agency collaborations, whether it's with the Department of Education on measuring and understanding connectivities to our schools, working with MnDOT on permitting and right-of-way access issues related to timely deployment of new broadband service, or with the staff of the Public Utilities Commission on how the Federal Lifeline program can be used to help more low-income families subscribe in their homes. Turn it over to Diane.
I'm going to talk about the mapping program and the grant program. This slide, and you've seen these before, show one of the results of the broadband mapping data that's collected, and it gives a quick snapshot of where we
Sorry.
stand today.
Cut you off there for a second. Would you pull that microphone close?
Sorry.
Thank you.
So you've seen these maps before, and they give you a quick snapshot of where we stand today when it comes to the state broadband goals. The left map shows that we are making progress overall to that 2022 goal of all homes and businesses having access to broadband service of at least 25 megabits down and 3 megabits upload. It points us towards the counties that may need some additional attention and possibly new strategies to get them to that baseline level of service and hopefully higher. You can see Lake of the Woods, Lincoln, Marshall, and Pine counties show up in the dark orange as areas where progress needs to be made, and in those 4 counties, just over 50% of the homes have access to that minimum definition of broadband. The map on the right shows progress towards the 2026 goal, and it shows that we have counties in the dark blue that are making significant progress to all homes and businesses having service to 100 megabit down and 20 megabit up. So they're making progress towards that long-term future need, but there is still ground to cover before the goal becomes due, and those are reflected more so in the yellow counties. This next slide you'll also be familiar with. It's the map that shows our broadband grant eligible areas, so it's the pink and the purple or blue areas. We gather this data annually from approximately 115 broadband providers that serve the state. And the data behind this map leads to an estimate of about 152,000 homes and businesses that don't yet have access to the 2022 goal, and about 293 homes that don't yet reach the 2026 target. Reformatting the data in some different ways, this map shows gigabit cities in Minnesota, and you can see that we have 496 cities that have at least 25% of the locations with access to gigabit speed service. That is up 50 cities from last year and from 286 cities in 2017. And tracking this statistic gives us an indicator of how current investments are preparing these cities for the future. On the flip side, we have 62 cities that still have more than 50% of their residents without the 25/3 access. But again, the numbers show we went from 186 cities 2 years ago to 62 this year, so that's positive change. And we also know a few more will be coming off the list as they are part of grant awards that were announced in January, and those towns include Ferrata, Renville, and Watson. Or in response to the pre-application or challenge process, we know providers have plans or have already upgraded areas in some towns, and those include Amboy, Thunder, Mapleton, Orinoco, Ostrander, Sargent, St. Clair, and Vernon Center. So we're going to see that number come down when we have the new data later this year. Next, I'll turn to the grant program, and you're very familiar with this. The purpose is to provide the financial assistance that's needed to make it a good investment for a provider. It pays for up to 50% of the costs of the infrastructure into unserved and underserved areas of the state. It doesn't reimburse for the costs to prepare an application, only costs incurred after the contract is fully executed. And as mentioned, this program has been in place since 2014. These are just some pictures showing what's all entailed in building out a broadband project. And just a quick overview of the grant program. There have been general fund appropriations for it in 6 out of the past 7 years. We distribute it in a single competitive grant round. The technology that's included has to be scalable to at least 100 meg up and down. There is a cap of $5 million per grant award. There is a requirement of at least a 1-to-1 match, and we do give additional points if an applicant comes in requesting less than 50% of the project costs. The grant awards have to be geographically dispersed, and the speeds offered must achieve 25/3. Many of our projects achieve the 100/20 or even gigabit speed. This slide, and I'm not going to read it, just talks directly from statute about who is eligible to apply. again, has a lot of words, but it's basically what we look at when, or what DEED looks at when we're deciding which applications to award. So we look at broadband speeds, number of passings, tribal area, are they served, is it an economically depressed area, is there a third source of funding, the sustainability of the project over time, evidence of community support, the pricing and speeds that'll be offered, are there community anchor institutions like schools, hospitals, township halls that are going to benefit, and then we ask for information on whether there is support for a low-income program. One specific area that we're often asked about, and that will be important to your understanding of the program, is how the federal broadband investments relate to the state program and how we consider them in the process. We map out the areas where federal funds are being invested and factor that information into every project evaluation. State-funded projects only go where there are no existing projects budgeted for or underway that meet or exceed the state's speed goals. And in some cases, there have been projects done in partnership with local and federal funds in order to get to faster speeds and get it in place sooner. And this is the slide that shows the recent grant awards with the fiscal 20 appropriation. Those applications were filed by September 13th of 2019, and the awards were announced in January of 2020. Our office received 80 applications requesting $70 million in grant funding. We were able to award 30 projects with $23.2 million in grant funding, and that was matched by $35.9 million in local private funding. And as you can see, they're fairly well dispersed across the state. This next slide shows the 5-year compilation of the projects. It shows again that awards have been made in all regions of the state, except notably the areas that are already served. About $105.6 million in state funds have leveraged over $146 million in private and local matching funds that have been used largely to push service into unserved areas of Minnesota. 80 of the 110 projects funded in the first 4 years have been completed, and right now our office is working to get the contracts executed for the 30 new projects that were awarded in January, so that when the ground thaws, that the projects can get underway. These are some of the partners that have participated in the grant program. And then one of our responsibilities when managing this portfolio of investments is to learn from what we're doing. Given the many unique situations that exist in the remaining areas of the state that need improvements, we know we will need a variety of solutions to get the job done. This list is just the beginning of some of the trends we're seeing develop, and we'll continue to watch as these projects come fully online. We know that hybrid networks, next generation fixed wireless, and electric cooperative involvement are all areas that we expect to grow in prominence over the next year and beyond. And finally, some additional pictures.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. On the mapping you do for the CAF funds, do you also do that for the USDA money that's coming into the state?
Mr. Chair, Senator Draheim, yes, we do have a layer on our map, and in fact, the USDA Reconnect funds, we work closely with the governor's office because the applicant there gets about 20 additional points from the USDA with a letter of support from the governor's office, and we do a review to make sure no state grant funding has gone there in the last 5 years.
Comments? Questions? I just had a quick comment or question. On your underserved and gigabyte cities, it looks like in the last 3 years, your gigabyte cities doubled, almost tripled, and the underserved is cut by, to a third what it was before. Is that a result of, we've got multiple programs that are kicking in money? Is that a result of programming? Is it a result of technology? you know, the speed just seems very fast with those changes that we made.
Mr. Vice Chair, Mr. Chair, I would say that it's absolutely a result of programs like ours and significant private investment in the state, and really the demand for those types of speeds in communities. We're seeing providers very interested in deploying higher speed networks to create those gigabit cities.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation today. Anybody else would like to come and testify? You are welcome to it. Otherwise, we will move on to Senate File 3049. Grant. Senate File 3049 will be laid over for possible inclusion in the omnibus finance bill. You ready, Senator Grant? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Pretty straightforward. Once again, we're asking for some additional resources, $30 million from the general fund. There's a presentation on where the funds are needed most, and I just want to remind everybody why we're pushing this. We have obviously the need for business and farmers. But we also have the telemental health, the health, and of course my kids' favorite, online entertainment. So I think we're at a place where we're down to 8 or 9% of unserved as a state, and looking at the last 2 years before we kick into the 2026 goal. And I just want to remind members, we do have a bunch of other bills that do address broadband that will be coming through other committees to try to look at how should we tackle this last 8 or 9% in some of our probably less profitable communities for companies to come into to offer broadband. So with that, I'll love to hear from the other testifiers.
Thank you, Senator. Ms. Leonard, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, and can you hear me okay? And members of the committee, my name is Jane Leonard. I'm president of Growth and Justice, a nonpartisan policy and research organization focused on building a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economy in Minnesota. I've been an active professional in rural community and economic development for nearly 40 years across the state and across the country. I'm pleased to be a member of and represent here today the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition. As you can see from the fact sheet that I think everybody has, I hope you have, our coalition is made up of more than 90 organizations representing a broad cross-sector of statewide and community interests, local governments, education, agriculture, Main Street businesses, manufacturing, healthcare, cooperatives, broadband providers, and more. We appreciate the work of Senator Draheim on this issue and many members of the Senate who are supporting the border-to-border broadband grant program, highlighting rural broadband as a priority in his work. To rural Minnesota since the early days of the technology, even before the advent of the World Wide Web, through the public-private partnership called Access Minnesota and other efforts that brought one 56 kilobit line to every county seat back in the early 1990s. More recently, I served as administrator of the state broadband grant program for the first 3 years of the program, with dedicated colleagues such as Diane Wells and Angie Dickinson and others at the Office of Broadband Development, and really great community and provider partners as well. This grant program is one of the most important investments we can make to ensure a sustainable economic future in greater Minnesota. Broadband touches every sector, and to ensure our businesses and citizens do not get left behind, it is critical for them to be able to access high-speed internet. And I say this not only as a rural community and economic development practitioner, but also as a fourth-generation farm owner in Isle Harbor Township, Mille Lacs County. Just as my great-grandparents invested in infrastructure they needed to be connected to world markets, so too do we need to continue our investments for our time. As you heard in 2018, the Governor's Broadband Task Force recommended $70 million per biennium to keep us on track to meet our statutory speed goals. Last year's $40 million investment was a big step in that direction, but left a $30 million gap in funding. Senate File 3049 would close that gap and fully fund the grant program for the first time in state history. We know the need is out there, you've heard that. With the $20 million available for grants last year, the Office of Broadband Development received 70 applications. Most of the requests do come from the hardest to reach areas of the state where people remain unserved. You've also heard the comparisons made between broadband expansion today and electrification of the countryside in the 1930s, and that couldn't be truer. Both then and now, there are significant portions of the state, especially low-density rural areas, that lack access to services with no practical way to get them. The business case just isn't there for providers to justify investing all on their own. So in response, you created a program in 2013, now known across the country as the Minnesota Model. And I am very proud to have served my fellow Minnesotans in that broadband grant program. It requires and inspires a public-private partnership that addresses unserved and underserved parts of our state head-on by targeting grants to rural communities without sufficient broadband. Just 20 years ago, access to high-speed internet was considered by most people as a want or a luxury. Our world has changed so drastically, so rapidly, that once was a want is now a need. It's a must. We need broadband to stay connected to each other, to do business, to grow our food, to educate our children, to deliver healthcare. Broadband has become an inextricable part of our everyday lives. So on behalf of our coalition, we ask that you provide $30 million in additional funding to close that funding gap and ensure stable funding for the grant program into the future. This amount moves us in the direction of the Rural Broadband Coalition's vision that, quote, everyone in Minnesota will be able to use convenient, affordable, world-class broadband networks that enable us to survive and thrive in our communities and across the globe. With that, I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Committee, any questions? Well, thank you for your testimony, and thank you very much also for the work that you've done over these last, especially these last few years regarding this issue. It's really making an impact in our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Mr. Larson.
Mr. Chair, members, Dan Larson, representing Minnesota rural counties today, 34 counties in greater Minnesota. We are the only organization that advocates specifically for rural county concerns. Here today, and happy to support Senate File 3049. Appreciate Senator Graham for bringing this bill forward, and appreciate the committee and the body's work on this issue over time. Though, it's no secret that access to high-speed, reliable internet is necessary to lead in education, business, and delivery of government services going forward. And will help alleviate concerns that we have of getting broadband wall, I guess, across the goal line. As we see from the maps, a lot of the easier areas to already have gotten done and turning the right color on the map. I look around the table at some of the districts that you represent, and these are some of the hardest areas that we're going to be going to. This is the red zone, if you want to look at it in terms of football or athletics. This is going to be the hardest push. It's while being on the advocate side, very appreciative of what's already been done. We need to move that ball across the board. So with that, I want message is to keep up the good work. It's pretty easy if you're already in areas that are served. If you have good service, if you have adequate access to the internet, it's pretty easy to ignore a bill like this. What Senator Greyhound is doing, and what I hope the committee will do, will consider those that are on the wrong side of the map, that are in the wrong colors on those maps. Think about how you operate without adequate or any access to the internet. So again, thank you for bringing the bill forward, Senator, and thanks for your consideration.
Mr. Larson, any questions for the testifier? Thank you. We'll now call Mr. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Brent Christensen, and I'm the President and CEO of the Minnesota Telecom Alliance. And I appreciate the opportunity to testify before this committee today. I am here in support of Senate File 3049. On behalf of the 44 telecommunications companies that make up the MTA, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Senator Draheim for bringing forth this bill, and thank you to the committee for funding this and supporting this last year, and more importantly, for funding it for both years of the biennium. Having 2 years of funding has proven to be an important step to allow our members to work with their communities to serve as they serve to plan more than 1 year at a time. Let me be clear on one point. If this bill passes and if it's signed into law, it doesn't mean we're done. It just means we're going to be done sooner. This program is not going to be needed forever, but it is going to be needed for at least a few more years. As we get more and more consumers connected to quality broadband, the ones that remain get harder and harder to serve. MTA members share the state goal of border-to-border broadband and have been active in the broadband grant program since its inception in 2014. We have 5 years of quantifiable data that prove that this program works and is successful in getting broadband to the most rural parts of our state. Under this program, state funding complements private investment to catalyze build-outs of broadband to areas that otherwise wouldn't be cost-effective to serve. Telecommunication networks are constantly evolving. Federal dollars and private provider investment go to upgrading and expanding networks, but those dollars are not enough to reach the hardest to serve customers in the most rural parts of our state. The border-to-border broadband grant program is imperative to reach those consumers. Mr. Chairman, members, the border-to-border broadband grant program, as you have heard, is known around the country as the Minnesota model. I've had the opportunity to testify about this program to similar committees in the Michigan and Kansas House of Representatives. Other states and even the federal government looked at this program as a template for successfully deploying rural broadband. I urge you to please support Senate File 3049 and give us the resources to get quality broadband to everyone in the state. Thank you, and I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Members, any questions? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony. Senator Draheim, any final comments?
Appreciate everybody's time and look forward to more discussion.
Thank you, Senator Draheim. This bill will be laid over for possible inclusion. Mr. Chair, you have the gavel. Would you like the gavel someone?
So you want it back to me. Thanks, Vice Chair Johnson. Thought I'd just be co-pilot for a little while. Members, that concludes our agenda for today, unless there's any other questions. With that, meeting is adjourned until Wednesday.